Okay, I think out of respect for all of you who are here on time, we'll get started. We are recording this, so if you know somebody who joins in late, everybody's going to get a copy of the PowerPoint later and I think a link to the recording. So you have joined the ABCs of Reading Instruction in New York City. I'm Maggie Moroff. Sarah Part is here with me too. We're going to go back and forth in terms of presenting. I just want to run you through sort of our goals today. We're going to start with an introduction. We are going to talk to you, Sarah's going to talk to you about how children learn to read and why some struggle to do so. She's going to talk to you about what's changing in the New York City Public Schools this year. I'm going to pick it back up then and talk about how to get help if your child is struggling with reading. Talk a little bit about programs and supports for students with disabilities in the New York City schools right now, and give you some tips for parent-teacher conferences, and then Sarah's going to close us out. A few things before we start. Obviously, learning to read isn't easy for many students, and lots of students struggle with that process. Sometimes it's just about the generalized instruction received in the schools, and there's a lot of work being done now to correct that for students in early education, those students who are in early ed now. But sometimes it's because of a disability that's gone undiagnosed or misdiagnosed or unsupported with appropriate specialized instruction. We're going to talk to you today about all of that, how students learn to read, how to get help, what's going on in the schools right now. We also want to note up front that reading supports aren't just for our youngest students. And I suspect that a lot of you here today have older students who might be struggling or work with older students. Today's presentation is aimed at the families of all students, including those in later elementary grades, middle school, and even high school. It's not too late for them to learn, but it will take some work to be sure that they get all the supports that they need from school staff and outside tutors so that they can learn to read while still in the system. If you have questions that come up, go ahead and put them in the chat. And if we have time, we'll address them while we're still on the screen. If not, we promise we'll get back to you directly after the fact. With that, I'm going to turn this over. Oh, no, actually, I want to talk just briefly about what Advocates for Children is and where Sarah and I work. Sorry. We are an independent agency. We work to protect the rights of New York City students. We do that a number of different ways. The one that is really key for you all probably is our helpline. The number is right up there on the screen, 1-866-427-6033. We also have a ton of guides and resources. We do workshops and trainings, and we provide free legal services to low-income families. We have been around for over 50 years, started by parents of students with disabilities, but the mission has really expanded over time. We work to make sure that every child from birth to age 21 has access to a quality education here in New York City, and that they get the supports and services they need along the way, and to which they have a right. I suspect that most of you who found your way to the webinar today know this already, but just in case, please, please, please go to our website. The link is there after this, and you can pull up all of those guides, all of those reports. You can get the number again. There's a whole lot to go much deeper into that is not just about the subject at hand today. With that, it is Sarah's turn for a while, and then I'll come back.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in with us today. So I'm going to start us off just with a general background overview about how children learn to read and why some struggle more than others to do so. And for some of you, it's possible that you may know some of this already, but we just want to make sure everyone is kind of coming in with the same background information, since it's really important for understanding why New York City is making any of these changes that they're making this year. So first thing to emphasize is that all kids can become proficient readers. This includes students who have severe dyslexia, students who have intellectual disabilities. Exceptions are extremely, extremely rare and would involve like very, very significant intellectual disabilities. So it gets harder as you get older if you don't learn to read in those early elementary grades, which is where they're doing a lot of work now in the public schools. But effective reading remediation is possible at any age. It is possible for all kids to learn how to read. Couple key points. Learning to read is not a natural or automatic process. So unlike spoken language, written language is a fairly recent human invention. So kids, a typically developing child is going to naturally learn to speak the languages, languages spoken by their community in their home and the environment where they're growing up. There's no area in the brain that's specifically devoted to reading. No one is just born to read. In order to read, like we're each building new pathways within our brains between areas that are primarily designed for other purposes. So for speech, for vision, what have you. There isn't like a spot in the brain that's specifically dedicated to reading like there is for speech. So some people's brains are going to have an easier time doing this than others, but it's not happening naturally or automatically for anyone. Another key point, we know how to teach kids how to read. Obviously, scientists are always learning new things from research, but the basic principles about what good reading instruction looks like are incredibly well established. There's really strong consensus around this. But part of the problem is that all that research hasn't always made it into the classroom. There's a lot of curriculum out there that's still infused with outdated ideas about how kids learn to read that we now know, thanks to more advanced research techniques, isn't true. And then a lot of teacher preparation programs, they aren't giving teachers, future teachers, the training, the information, the skills they need to be able to teach reading effectively, which means a lot of kids end up not getting what they need once they're in the classroom. Last key point before we move on, the type of instruction that works with students that works for students with dyslexia benefits all kids. What kids who have dyslexia and similar disabilities need is not qualitatively different from what works for everybody. It's just they need a lot more of it. They're going to need a lot more practice, a lot more repetition for it all to click. So reading, getting meaning from print, has two major components. The first is word recognition or decoding. So that is breaking the code that connects the sounds that you hear in spoken language to the letters that represent those sounds in print. And that is multiplied by the second major component, which is language comprehension, understanding what the words mean. And you have to be able to understand and use spoken language, have vocabulary, have content knowledge about the world in order to understand what those words mean once you get them off the page. And this is essentially an equation where those two big buckets of things are multiplied. And that's because they're both essential. If either half of the equation is a zero, if you don't have decoding or you don't have comprehension, you're not really reading. You can't read. The product is zero. So a student can have trouble with just the word recognition piece, with just the language comprehension piece, or with both pieces. And because you build your language comprehension skills, you build your vocabulary, your knowledge about the world by reading widely, kids who are initially just struggle with the decoding, the word recognition piece, it often leads to a vicious circle where they end up having trouble with both pieces because they're understandably avoiding reading. They're having a lot of trouble getting the words off the page. And when all your brain effort is just going towards the decoding piece, you don't have brain space left over to really be focusing on the content and the meaning of what you're reading. So you're not building that vocabulary and content knowledge to become an even better reader. And this is called the simple view of reading in the research, decoding times language comprehension. This general framework, it's not specific to English. This applies across languages, and it's transferable across languages as well. So a concrete example to make this slightly less theoretical, the word cat. The word recognition piece of reading is seeing the set of lines on the screen and turning them into spoken language. And you do that because you can understand the relationships between sounds and letters. You know that cat is made up of 3 separate sounds, each of which is represented by a letter. Like that curved line that's a C, that doesn't inherently have meaning on its own. You know that it represents the k sound in cat. So that's the decoding the word recognition piece. The language comprehension piece is knowing what a cat is. And this is Maggie's cat, Artemis, in an AFC tote bag. And so not only can you say the word cat, you already know what a cat is. You have a picture in your mind of a cute furry creature that you can keep as a pet that has pointed ears and whiskers. You know, you have a whole lot of knowledge about cats. So when you first decode the word, it has meaning for you. Whereas if you were to read the sentence, Felis catus in a bag, and we hadn't just been talking about cats and there wasn't a picture of a cat right there, your reaction would probably be like, wait, what is in a bag? I don't understand. Even though that phrase means the same thing as cat in a bag. It's just the scientific term for cat. So what does this mean as far as instruction and what's happening in the classroom? There are 5 essential components to reading instruction, sometimes called the 5 pillars. 3 are focused more on the decoding word recognition piece of that equation, and the other 2 are focused more on the language comprehension piece. And some folks will add like a 6th pillar, writing. This is just like a broad framework. I see that there's 2 things in the chat. Yes, we will get to that question. A little later on, we're going to be talking more about what specifically New York City is doing and then the specifics of that. So 5 pillars of reading instruction. First is phonemic awareness. So before kids can learn how to read, they first have to understand that words, spoken words, can be broken down into smaller chunks, and being able to notice and use those chunks in spoken language. So like recognizing syllables within words, recognizing words that rhyme, either things like that. That's a skill called phonological awareness. And phonemic awareness is a specific type of phonological awareness. It's the ability to hear and work with the individual sounds, which are called phonemes, that make up spoken words. So this is, to go back to our previous example, this is hearing the word cat said out loud and being able to recognize that those are 3 separate sounds, k, a, t, that have all been smushed together to form a word. Phonics, a type of instruction that teaches children how to connect the sounds that they hear to the letters they see on the page. Knowing those letter sound relationships is what lets us decode or sound out words we haven't seen before. And phonics essentially explains the rules of written language and the exceptions to those rules. So this is teaching children that the k sound can be represented by the letter C, as in cat, but it can also be represented by other spelling patterns, like K, as in kite. So it's explaining all those rules, the exception to those rules, in a very systematic way, building kids' knowledge of how letters represent sounds. Fluency is the ability to read easily, correctly, with the right expression and speed. So fluent readers recognize words right away without having to sound them out each time. When you first saw the word cat on the screen, you likely recognized it instantly without even having to think about it. And that comes with lots and lots of practice with reading text out loud over and over. So if you ask your child to read out loud to you, you can likely get a very general sense of where they're at with fluency. Does it sound natural? Does it sound smooth like they do when they're talking to you? Or is there lots of stopping and starting and pauses between words? You'll definitely be hearing that when they're first learning how to read, but as they get more proficient, you'll want their reading to become much smoother and sound much more natural. Vocabulary, pillar number 4, refers to the words we know and use. It's a lot easier for beginning readers to sound out words that they already have heard and said many times before. It's knowing the first time you decode the word cat, what a cat is, and being able to connect that word on the page with a picture in your mind of what is a cat. And a large vocabulary is super important for comprehension. In order to understand what we read, we first have to know what most of the words mean and how they can be used in different contexts. And last one, comprehension, the ability to understand what you're reading and get meaning from print. So that's making connections between what you read, what you already know, being able to draw conclusions based on the text. So this requires vocabulary, like I just said, the ability to understand spoken language, things like figurative language, the ways in which we use language that are not literal, and also knowing a lot about the subject at hand that you're reading about. So that's why a good English language arts curriculum is going to be building content knowledge. It's not just phonics. It's also going to be building kids' knowledge about history, about geography, about science, about art, building their stores of knowledge about the world. And then another piece of it is also teaching comprehension skills, which is teaching how to kind of self-monitor your understanding, to ask yourself questions like, what's the most important point that the author's trying to make here? Or like, why did things happen that way? And those are concrete skills that you learn in comprehension instruction. So there are two major approaches to reading instruction, and all of this is a very, very high level overview. Very bare bones. So structured literacy is an approach to teaching reading that's based on the science. It starts from the premise that learning to read isn't natural. So we need to explicitly teach kids everything they need to know. So that includes a lot of explicit and systematic phonics. Kids learn how to break words apart into their individual sounds. They're taught letter-sound relationships in a systematic way. So building cumulatively from easier and consistent patterns to more complicated ones. And then they learn how to use that knowledge to decode words. And everything's very directly and clearly explained. Lessons follow a consistent structure, logical order, so kids know what to expect. And there's lots and lots of opportunities to practice and get feedback. Other approach, balanced literacy, includes some phonics, but phonics isn't emphasized or taught systematically. So instead of just focusing on sounds and letters, balanced literacy classrooms will often also encourage memorizing words or guessing based on context or pictures, or maybe just like the first letter of the word. And that will prevent a lot of kids from developing the really strong decoding skills that they're going to need once those pictures go away and once they have to read longer and more difficult texts. So structured literacy, that's going to encourage students to sound it out when they come across an unfamiliar word. Balanced literacy will present sounding out as just one option that you can also guess at words based on context, based on pictures. And this is especially harmful for kids with disabilities, but it's not a particularly good way to teach anyone. So structured literacy, essential for students who have dyslexia, but it's not bad for anyone. If anything, it's good for everyone. Whereas balanced literacy, some kids will still learn how to read in balanced literacy classrooms, but they're not doing so because balanced literacy is great. They're doing so essentially in spite of these practices. So reading difficulties exist along a continuum. It's a spectrum, kind of like height, where some people are especially tall, some people are especially short. Everyone can kind of agree that like LeBron James is tall. But most of us kind of fall somewhere in the middle. Whether or not we seem tall or short depends like on the context, who we're standing next to. So reading difficulties are similar. There's one end of the spectrum, which is dyslexia and language-based learning disabilities, which experts estimate is between 1 in 5 and to 1 in every 10 students. And these are students for whom learning how to read is always going to be more difficult, no matter what, just because of how their brains are wired. And then on the opposite end, on the green side, there are some kids for whom learning to read is going to appear fairly effortless. Like regardless of what kind of instruction they're getting in the classroom, they're going to be able to learn how to read. For most kids in the middle, how well they learn to read depends a lot on what kind of instruction they get. And this is why New York City is making efforts, as we'll talk about in just a minute, to kind of change the way reading is taught broadly across the whole system, because all these kids in the middle, how well they're learning to read really depends on the curriculum that's being used, how instruction is happening in the general classroom. So some kids who are in this big middle bunch will get referred for special education services, but the only reason because they can't read, but the only reason they can't read is because they didn't get quality instruction in the first place. No one actually taught them how to read. And then there are other students who their difficulties won't be quite as severe, so they aren't going to end up in special education, but they're not going to learn to read as well as they could. They're going to struggle more than is necessary just because they weren't taught what they needed to know to be good readers. So a little bit more about dyslexia. Dyslexia, it's the most common learning disability. And students with dyslexia typically have trouble with reading because they have trouble mastering the relationships between the sounds of spoken language and the letters of print. So that means they have a hard time converting the written letters they see on the page into words they can say out loud, even though those words might be part of their spoken vocabulary. And that manifests as difficulty with accurate and fluent word recognition. It's really hard to get the words off the page quickly and accurately, which then prevents you from being able to focus on meaning and getting meaning from text. Dyslexia is not something that kids outgrow. It's neurobiological, meaning brain-based condition. It's not just a matter of being a late bloomer. But that said, students with dyslexia are just as able as their peers to learn how to read, to do well academically. It's going to be more challenging, and they'll need a lot more practice and repetition to really master those foundational skills of phonemic awareness and phonics and fluency, but it's 100% possible. The trick is that the sooner they get that specialized instruction and that intensive support, the better. Addressing difficulties as soon as they show up helps keep students from falling behind, from losing self-esteem. When kids don't get the help they need early on, frustration and embarrassment over not being able to read can manifest with anxiety and mental health challenges, with acting out type behaviors. Also worth noting, has absolutely nothing to do with intelligence. Nothing whatsoever. So this is just a few signs to kind of keep an eye out for. Someone had asked when they registered about, what are the signs and symptoms of dyslexia? We have AFC has a fact sheet on reading milestones, which maybe Maggie, can you drop her in the chat?
Yeah.
That kind of goes through in a little more detail than I'm going to do right now, the skills your child should be mastering at each grade level from pre-K through second grade, just those early grades. And some possible warning signs of a disability at different ages. So students with dyslexia often struggle to learn nursery rhymes as little kids to be able to recognize, if two words rhyme or not. They generally have a lot of trouble learning the names and sounds of different letters. Once they start reading instruction, they read aloud really slowly and awkwardly, lots of stopping and starting and mispronunciations, lots of skipping over words. They might make wild guesses at words based on just the first letter. And another big one, students become really frustrated and upset when asked to read, or will go to great lengths to avoid reading because it's so frustrating for them. And dyslexia also often runs in families, so that can be another kind of red flag in your mind. If you or somebody else in your family had a lot of trouble learning how to read in school, or reading just has never been easy for you, regardless of whether you ever got a diagnosis or got services in school, that can kind of be a warning sign that your kid might be more likely to also have trouble and you might want to look at extra help. One other thing worth noting before we move on, dyslexia is not a visual problem. This is kind of like a common myth about it as a disability. The common myth being that the main symptom is seeing or writing letters backwards, like reversing B's and D's. That is not correct. Students with dyslexia don't see letters and words any differently than other children. And it's actually really common for kids to do things like reverse B's and D's when they're first learning how to read and write. That on its own is not a sign that a student definitely has dyslexia. And some students with dyslexia will never reverse letters. So just because a student doesn't do that also doesn't mean they don't have a disability. Is there a, oh yes, thank you, Maggie, for the chat.
Trying to keep up.
I just want to make sure it wasn't another question. So what's changing in New York City Public Schools this year? So I imagine a lot of you have heard about New York City Reads. And this is an effort to move the New York City Public Schools away from balanced literacy, which is what they've been doing for the past 20 or so years, and towards structured literacy. So to make sure that every student is getting those strong foundational skills in the very early grades, and that schools are using practices aligned with research. So one of the big components here is curriculum. So each of the city's 32 community school districts has to pick one of 3 curricula that were pre-approved by Central to use in grades K to 5 in all its elementary schools. So the 3 options, which you may have heard of, the names aren't super important, but since you may have heard some of them, Into Reading, L Education, and Wit and Wisdom are the 3 options. And then for foundational skills instruction in grades K to 2, schools have the option of, again, 3 programs, Foundations, Really Great Reading, or Haggerty Phonemic Awareness. And this is necessary because in the past, every school in New York City was choosing its own curriculum. There wasn't any consistency from school to school, which is really problematic if, you know, a child needed to switch schools, especially mid-year. There wasn't even necessarily a consistency from one classroom to the next within a single school. So whatever your child was getting, it was really kind of luck of the draw. And so this is really an attempt to create some kind of consistency across the system and to make sure that everybody's using programs that were research-based. Because in the past, like, schools could really do whatever they wanted. It didn't have to align with the research. So this is rolling out over 2 years. This is the first year, 23-24. It's in 15 districts. So the districts that are shaded in the kind of teal color on this map, 1 in Manhattan, 2 in the Bronx, 4 in Queens, and a bunch in Brooklyn. So that's where elementary schools are rolling out new curriculum this school year. All the other districts, it's going to roll out next year. And there are some District 75 schools that are involved in this, and it's across all classrooms. So Maggie will talk a little bit more about special education later on, but we're talking like this is true in ICT, integrated co-teaching classrooms. It's happening in self-contained special education classrooms. It's happening in bilingual classes. It's really system-wide for core instruction. So another aspect of New York City Reads is screening and assessment. So universal screening, all schools are supposed to be screening students 3 times a year for potential problems with reading. Generally, that should happen in September, January, and May. And screeners are very, very quick assessments that identify students who aren't on track with their reading skills and who may need extra support. They can't diagnose dyslexia. They're very, very quick. They're not a standardized test in the way we normally think of standardized tests. The point is for teachers to be able to guide instruction and to figure out what kids need so we can give it to them. And different schools use different screening tools for different grade levels. The approved options are Acadience, Map Growth, iReady, and Degrees of Reading Power, if you've heard any of those names. And they're tools that are used not just in New York City, but across the country. So they can help you understand not just how your child's doing compared to the other kids in their class, but compared to a much wider pool, compared to national norms. And the school should let you know what screening tool they're using for your child's grades and then how your child did, what their results were. Your results should be available in your NYCSA account. I haven't actually looked to know if that's happening, but in theory, they should be there. If not, that's a great thing to ask about at your parent-teacher conference, how your child did on both the beginning of the year screener and the mid-year screener. And screening data can be kind of confusing, especially if you're not a data person, if you aren't an educator and don't have a background in this, it can be kind of confusing to understand these reports. So don't be afraid to ask lots of follow-up questions. If you talk about this at your parent-teacher conference. Make them explain it to you in a way you understand. And so you understand what it's saying about where your child is relative to their grade level, to the other kids in their class. So second piece of the screening and assessment framework is diagnostic assessments. So if that initial universal screening shows cause for concern, then the school might give your child additional tests called secondary screeners or diagnostic assessments. And these are designed to better understand their specific needs and figure out the right way to respond. And even though they are called diagnostic assessments, they don't actually diagnose a disability like dyslexia. They're tools to help schools better identify the specific skills where students need more instruction so they can develop a plan of action for them providing that support. Then for students who are getting reading intervention based on the results of that diagnostic assessment, there's going to be progress monitoring. And Maggie's going to talk a little bit more about intervention shortly. But progress monitoring, that's kind of assessment that happens every week, every other week to see how the intervention is going, to make sure it's actually helping and to guide the interventionist and make sure they're giving the student whatever it is that they need to make progress. I'm just going to look in the chat real quick.
Yeah, Sarah, there's actually, there are a number of questions about things you've just said. So,
yes.
A question about whether or not Heggerty is a structured approach.
Yeah, I got it pulled up. Yes, Heggerty is a structured approach, which is why all the 3 programs that the DOE approved for foundational skills in K-2, those are all structured evidence-based approaches. Are these screening?
Question about
I've read, yeah, some people, so the question is, I have read that some believe there are benefits to dyslexia as a different way of learning. Can you speak to any of those positive framings? So I don't think there's any like scientific research that like clearly demonstrates that the challenges with dyslexia come alongside benefits that other folks don't have. Doesn't mean that's not true. It's just, it hasn't been proven by research yet. But just like anecdotally, a lot of folks feel like kids who have dyslexia, the ways in which they are forced to compensate when they don't get the instruction they need also helps them to become more creative thinkers, and gives them different ways of thinking that can be a unique skill, especially once you get into the workforce. Some of these screening tools have been used before. The big difference here is that they're now being used citywide in all schools. Because before, as I was saying, like individual schools could kind of do whatever they wanted. So some schools were not using any of these. It is brand new that they're implementing these. And they're learning in real time, you know, how do you use them? How do you use that data? What does it mean? And then some schools have been doing this for some amount of time. Okay. One more slide, and then I'll let Maggie take over. The last aspect of New York City Reads is that schools are also beefing up their ability to provide intensive intervention to struggling readers. So a few different things going on. There are 100 intensive reading interventionists who are working in 111 of the phase 1 elementary schools. Those are the elementary schools and districts that are rolling out the new curriculum this year. And these staff are providing small group support to struggling readers, and then also working to build schools' capacity for intervention work. So like figuring out like when in the school day do you do these interventions? How do you structure that? How do you set up the systems to keep this work going? And this is happening as under Academic Intervention Services, or AIS, which we're going to talk about more shortly. Then there are also 960 special education intervention teachers. They used to be called IEP teachers. And they existed before New York City Reads, but they've been getting some additional training through NYC Reads. And they are in middle and high schools as well as elementary schools, which means they can provide intervention to older students as well, which I know a few folks had asked about. So their job, not all of it, but a chunk of it is dedicated to providing reading interventions to students with and without disabilities. Despite the fact that special education is in the name, they also work with students who are not in special education. And we're going to talk a bit more at the end of the presentation about where you can find out like what is available at your particular school, because I know that's what people are most interested in. South Bronx Literacy Academy, that's a brand new public school that just opened this year in District 7 in the Bronx. It is open to students with and without disabilities who need extra support building strong literacy skills, who are really going to benefit from a super structured approach. This year, the school just has grades 2 and 3, but they're going to be expanding upward through grade 8. And you can learn more about that school on the DOE's website. There's an application process. Students from the Bronx have priority admissions, and their teacher getting a lot of really intensive training and working with students who have dyslexia or other reading difficulties. Then last piece, there's a number of schools that kind of are getting extra money for structured literacy pilot programs. So PS 125 in Harlem is one of these that's been getting a lot of extra money and resources and doing a lot of work to implement structured literacy in their school. In District 15 in Brooklyn, Assemblymember Bobby Carroll has given some funding to a few different elementary schools to help them do this work. So there's a handful of other pilot programs kind of going on around the city. And those are all in zone schools. So not everywhere, but hopefully we'll be expanding further in the future. Let me look at the questions real quick, and then I will let Maggie. Will you be sharing this presentation with them? Yes. Maggie, feel free to jump in. I'll look at the questions in the chat.
Okay, we'll get started because we have a lot to say. So I'm going to talk to you about how to get help if your child is struggling with reading. If you think that your child may be having trouble learning to read or write, ask for the help sooner rather than later. You know your child better than anyone, and waiting and seeing rarely helps, even though schools have been known to tell families that frequently. We're not suggesting, and somebody wrote to us earlier asking this, that you formally assess your child at home. But if you have other children at home or friends who have other children, you probably have a sense of where your child is on that reading spectrum. And if it raises concerns for you, whether or not they are in fact struggling, it's okay to ask at the school, and we're about to encourage you to do a whole lot of asking. So our goal is to give you some tools to dialogue with the people at the school and beyond, and talk to them and get a sense from them about the available options in the actual school. First thing I want to talk about, and I see it's already up on the screen, are Academic Intervention Services, or AIS. These are student-supported services. They're offered in addition to general education instruction, and they're meant to help students achieve learning standards. These are something that anyone who needs any extra academic help should be able to get, regardless of where the student attends school. They are offered, as I said before, in addition to the general education classroom instruction, and they're designed to assist students in meeting proficiency with the established learning standards. So to show proficiency on the standardized tests. State education guidelines require that all districts provide AIS to assist students in grades K through 12. So I promised you we would be talking about older students also. Students who are getting special ed supports are still eligible for AIS services. I'm going to talk about special ed in a minute. So are students who are learning English. Neither of those things is a block to getting AIS services. It's not a special education evaluation or a class, and it's really important to know. If the school doesn't need your permission to provide AIS, but they do need to tell you if they're doing that, if they're doing it, and if they stop at some point providing the services. In that, you can get more information in that writing about what's going on, but you can also ask. And one of our last slides is going to be about things you can ask specifically for at the school. Another, go ahead, Sarah. Another large scale piece that may be available, that should be available to all students, is something called response to intervention, sometimes referred to as RTI. The triangle here on the screen is a pretty good depiction of what happens. So the bottom is core classroom instruction. All kids in the classroom get literacy instruction. Those who are struggling a little bit more get that middle band, the targeted small group instruction, and then at the very top, for kids who continue to struggle, there are intensive interventions. These are designed specifically for kids in grades K, kindergarten through 5th grade, who are in general education settings. The schools are required to offer RTI services before they make a referral for special education based on a student struggling to learn to read. They can make a referral based on something else. That doesn't mean that a parent can't make a referral at any time, and we will talk about that shortly. RTI is, as you can see here, what they call a multi-tiered approach that should be used to find and support struggling students in academics, and it's also used for those who offer behavioral challenges. We're talking here specifically about literacy. As I said, it uses an increasingly intensive and personalized approach to supporting those students. It is based very much, and should be based very much, on testing to figure out the specific strengths and needs of students. That second tier, the targeted small group instruction, is done in small groups of 3 to 5 students a couple times a week in sort of short periods, 20 to 30 minutes. And then that third tier, students get much more intensive and individualized instruction, and they spend more time at it, working with a teacher or a reading specialist who has been specifically trained to provide the support. You're going to hear us talk about specifically trained a few times today, really important. Whereas AIS follows the fear that a student isn't meeting standards, RTI relies on data and progress monitoring of the individual student. So it really should be much more based on sort of what the monitoring is showing. It should be 100%, it should involve systematic, I always want to say systemic instruction. So building on sets of skills that the student already has in a logical and proven order. So not just throwing spaghetti at the wall and hoping it sticks. Once upon a time, when I was a teacher, that's what we did for teaching literacy. We did a little of this, a little of that, and we hoped that the kids would learn. The school, as in AIS, the school doesn't need your permission for this, but they are obligated to provide it. It as in the RTI, if the student is showing signs of struggling to learn to read. They have to let you know if they're providing tiered instruction and give you information about that instruction. Again, we're going to tell you a couple times today to ask for detail on that sort of thing. With AIS and RTI, it's fine to, and we strongly encourage you to ask the school questions. I know I keep saying that, but it's really important. You are a full partner in this. So what programs is the school using? Why are they using that program? Who's providing the interventions? How has that person been trained? How often are they meeting with your child? For how long, etc. The other thing I want to say about RTI is that it is designed and implemented and monitored by a multidisciplinary team of professionals. So it is not just your student's classroom teacher providing more and more intervention. All right, I'm going to talk to you in a really abbreviated way about the special education process, really abbreviated. It's important here, as some students with dyslexia or other learning disabilities may need individualized special education supports in addition to the AIS and RTI that I just talked about. Students with disabilities who require extra support or specialized instruction to make progress during their time in school have a legal right to receive those services. Students who get special education services will do so under something called an individualized education program, and I'll talk about that in a second. I want to talk about the process for getting an IEP, so that's what this diagram you're seeing here on the screen is right now. That IEP is going to, that's the end goal, and then placement and services. That IEP is going to lay out the strengths and the needs and the specific services, and that your student is going to receive, and a change in placement, if that is necessary. After I talk about, oh, actually, let me just say, this goes for a student who is already getting special ed services and may need some fine tuning around literacy, since that's today's topic. It also applies to students who have never gotten special ed services and are just starting in the process. If you want more on the special ed process in general, we're going to give you links to our website if you haven't already been there. We have workshops and guides that go into far, far more detail than we have time to do today. Okay, the first step of the process is something called referral. Parents or legal guardians and schools can refer a student for special education. If you do it in writing, keep a copy, send it to your child's principal, the school-based support team, and or your committee on special education. Please remember that what I said a few slides ago, that schools are required to offer RTI services before they make a referral for special ed based on how a student is maybe struggling to learn to read. You can make a referral at any time. You don't need to wait that process out. AIS is a slightly different bucket. The next step after referral, whether or not you make the referral or the school makes the referral, is getting a parent's consent. So within 10 school days of referral, the school has to ask for the parent's consent to evaluate their child. The consent has to be written, voluntary, and informed. You can withdraw that consent at any time. And once the clock starts ticking for the DOE, they have 60 school days to finish the process and put services or placement or new services and placement into place. Because the timeline starts with consent, you should be watching out for delays. Note that if your primary language is another language than English, the school should make sure that you can think about that consent in your own language, so that somebody doesn't grab you in the hall and ask you in English and just say, sign here. Consent is usually gotten when the school does something called a social history, which is usually done as a part of the evaluation process, or sort of just to kick it off. That needs to happen, as I said before, within 10 school days. Note, school days is different from calendar days. So calendar days is 10 days, counting now, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. School days is only the days that the school is in process, and you're going to count that way. Do keep track of all of this stuff. If you've never been through the process, it's really helpful to keep copies of things, copies of anything you write, copies of anything you sign. It's all stuff that you're going to want to look at later. After consent, we move on to evaluations. A couple things I want to say about those too. They need to be bilingual. If a student uses a language other than English, they need to be free to the family. The school has to evaluate and reevaluate every 3 years, but they can do so more frequently if circumstances suggest the need for that. Parents have rights to receive copies of their evaluations. I want to talk briefly about private and independent evaluations. They're not here on the slide, but if you decide that you want, no, sorry, Sarah. If you decide that you want to get one done by somebody not connected to the schools, you have 2 different paths that you can follow. One is to get a private evaluation where you get them yourself, you make all of the arrangements, you pay for them or you use your insurance for them, and then you can share them with the school. The other is an independent evaluation. These are also outside evaluations that function more like a second opinion. When you have reason to think that the evaluation the school has done is problematic, or when the school hasn't done their evaluation at all within that timeline we just talked about. For these, you'll need to ask the IEP team in writing, always in writing, keep a copy, and they may not agree. If they agree, they'll pay for the independent evaluation using an assessment authorization, so essentially a voucher. at a pre-approved rate from the city, or they'll file an impartial hearing and try to explain to the hearing officer why they think their evaluations are good enough. You will have a chance, if that happens, to explain why you want yours considered in addition. So evaluations are done at the school, or they are done sort of along the way through one of those two other paths. Once those are done, the IEP team is going to come together. Go ahead, Sarah, thank you, and develop the IEP. The school is going to hold a meeting to develop or modify, if your student already has one, their individualized education program, almost always referred to as IEP. This world is full of acronyms, and I'm trying to be really thoughtful about not slipping into them, but I'm sure I'm making mistakes. IEPs are individualized, they are legally binding, so they are like a contract, and they are meant to be used for 1 year. If the school fails to do a new IEP, there are very special circumstances around that, but the team should be coming back together each year to look at how things went, whether or not things need to be tweaked. They should tweak, right? Because your students should be making progress during that year. At the meeting, there are a number of players that are going to be involved. Parents are always key members of the IEP team. Special education and general education teachers appear at those meetings. General ed, if there's any chance that the student will be spending any of their day with general education peers. The school psychologist, somebody who can talk about other options in and around the district, and anyone else that's appropriate, so including translators if English is not your first language, or advocates if you bring somebody along with you. Also on this, I want to say a few things. IEPs should be based on what a student needs and not what the school has to offer. That's really, really key here in this conversation about providing literacy supports. Each student's IEP should look different. Mine and Sarah's should not be identical, because Sarah and I learn differently and have different, in the adult context, we have different areas of expertise, but we have different strengths than one another. And as I said before, they should be reviewed at least once a year. But if something is going on in the middle of the year, you don't have to wait until 12 months have passed to have a conversation, again, in this context, about what's going on. Why is my child struggling learning to read? I want to spend a little bit of time, and I know we are pushing on 5 o'clock, so I'm going to speak fast about programs and supports for students with disabilities in the New York City's public schools. There are, one more thing about the IEP, actually. Dyslexia and specific methodology can be included on the IEP. The State Department of Education encourages IEP teams to include language about dyslexia and other learning disabilities on IEPs when appropriate. And it will sometimes be appropriate in those instances to identify specific methodology for an individual student. Where that's the case, school staff can, who are going to deliver that specific methodology, need to be properly trained in order to do so. There's nothing in any law, federal, state, or city that says dyslexia doesn't belong on an IEP, even though we still hear some school teams saying that they think that's the case. The state has, as I just said, encouraged its use. IEPs for students with dyslexia should describe the student's disability, include consideration of assistive technology devices and services, which I'm going to talk about in a second, specify appropriate classroom instructional supports and modifications, and testing accommodations, all to be discussed in a moment. Districts are required to make sure that students with dyslexia receive appropriate, specially designed instruction to meet their individual needs. In this case, district meaning New York City as a whole. That obviously hasn't always been the case. There's a whole lot of advocacy going on right now around changing that, and the DOE is getting on board as well, as evidenced by some of Sarah's talking earlier. Okay, I want to talk about assistive technology. AT is any device or support for using that device that helps an individual student with a disability learn. It provides alternative ways of accessing material. It's not meant to teach new material. It's really designed to specifically meet the unique needs and learning styles and preferences of each student who uses it, and to help those kids reach their full potential by helping support and buttress specific difficulties in completing academic and classroom activities. It can provide alternative methods of task completion and information processing. Consider reading and writing. It's a really good example here. So a student may need some help via text to speech or speech to text to engage with their peers, even if they're still struggling with the mechanics of learning to read. There's obviously no reason they can't partake in the classroom discussion as long as they get that sort of the content of the reading a different way. So AT can help enable a student who may not be reading as fluently as their peers take in the content and participate. This is especially true for older students, where the content of what's being read is so important, and where some of the peers may be at a point where they've moved on from learning to read to reading to learn. Sometimes you'll hear that phrase used. All of these students are reading. AT doesn't mean that the students aren't reading. It is a support. Examples of AT include individually assigned computers and tablets with specific software and applications loaded onto them, writing aids, screenwriting software, speech to text, and text to speech. I know that it is 5 o'clock. I just want to interrupt myself to say that we are recording this. And if people have time constraints, I know that there are a number of parents here. You will have a chance to watch it after the fact. So stay with us if you can, but don't worry too much. Similar to assistive technology, but different, are accessible educational materials. These are materials that are designed to be used by a variety of students in a variety of formats. They're made available to students. So materials can be made available to students in print, in a digital format, in a graphic format, audio, video, or visual presentation. Ideally, one instructional piece or lesson can be designed so that with some minor adjustments, the same content can be offered to students who take that content in different ways. It just changes the mode of delivery, but not of what's being taught. I'm going to keep going as quickly as I can. Accommodations and modifications are also really important to think about here. Some students are going to need one or both in order to participate in the general curriculum. Accommodations change the way that students approach the curriculum. It's the same curriculum. Modifications change the material that's actually being presented. Examples of accommodations include things like extended time for test taking, passages being read aloud, or the use of a keyboard in writing. Modifications, as I said, are adjustments to the assignments and the assessments themselves. So they change the standard that the student is expected to meet by changing the content and the way that we measure the student's work. They're really meant for a student who always try accommodations first and modifications second. Modification usually mean that a student will be expected to complete less work and less challenging work than their peers, which makes sense in some instances. But remember, with modifications, that gap is never, it's just going to get bigger and bigger. It's not going to get closed at some point. I want to talk about one particular program that the DOE is offering in a number of schools, because it is something that could be added to an IEP, and that's Intensive Reading Education and Development, or the IREAD Early Literacy Program. It's a specialized program that exists for kids with IEPs. It's very limited in kindergarten and first grade. And it's only currently in 8 schools, 1 or 2 in each of our boroughs. Families are going to apply for these when their children are in pre-K or kindergarten. It includes a reduced class size and an ICT model. ICT is integrated co-teaching, so 2 teachers in the room working with students with and without disabilities. Give me a second. In IREAD Classroom, students can get targeted literacy support that's been woven into every subject area. Also, a part-time intervention teacher is going to push into the classroom and work directly with individual students. Push in means they come into the classroom, and instead of pulling the kid out to do sort of hallway or resource room tutoring. It is in 8 schools currently, 1 in Manhattan, 2 in the Bronx, 2 in Brooklyn, 2 in Queens, and 1 in Staten Island. There are a limited number of seats given the number of programs, and families definitely need to apply for them. No student is going to be assigned to them. Okay, we just threw a whole lot of information to you about what should be and what you may have a right to get. What if you disagree with the DOE? What if you and the school are not seeing things the same in terms of your students' needs and what they may need and be entitled to in order to support their learning? So there are 2, and this is another thing that we do entire presentations on. There are 2 processes. There's informal dispute resolution and formal due process. You can follow both routes. We encourage you to try informal first. It is less adversarial. It is more likely to happen quickly. I'm so sorry if you can hear the sirens outside of my office. For informal advocacy, you're going to start with your school. So talk to the teacher, the principal, the superintendent's office, and then move up to central offices. We have a really good guide on rights in special ed available on our website, so hopefully you'll take a look at that. Formal due process is more litigatory, right? So it's facilitated IEP meetings, mediation, impartial hearings, and state and federal complaints. Last thing from me before Sarah closes us out are we want to offer you some specific tips for parent-teacher conferences, which is how we told you we were planning on talking about things. So there are a lot of questions you can ask, and we really encourage you to do so. And even if the person in the parent-teacher conference before you asks the same questions, you should ask them about your child. You're there to talk about your child and your child only. So some of the things we suggest are, what should my child be able to do by the end of this year with respect to reading? Are they on track for that? How are you monitoring my child's progress throughout the year? Because remember, we told you they need to monitor. Is my child receiving any extra help or interventions, those AIS services or the RTI services, beyond what everyone else is getting in the classroom, right? And if the answer is yes, then you want to know what services they're getting, what program they're using. Same questions as before, right? Who's providing it? What kind of training do they have? And if no, you want to talk to them about other interventions that may be available at the school. You can always ask for more detail, and I think we're going to include links in a minute for our tip sheet on literacy and parent-teacher conferences, which has many, many more suggestions than this. We have just updated it, and we hope that you'll find it really helpful. Sarah's going to close us out with some links, and then we're going to ask you to evaluate us. So.
Maggie, do you mind dropping the links to both the literacy Q&A and the parent-teacher conference fact sheet in the chat?
Yep.
Thank you. So just a couple additional helpful links in addition to the fact sheets. We have 2 major fact sheets. One is on a Q&A on literacy and dyslexia that covers a lot of the information we went through today. And then we also have the one Maggie just mentioned, which is suggested questions to ask about your child's progress in reading at the parent-teacher conference. So hopefully you'll find that helpful going into conferences. Few other helpful links. First one. This spreadsheet, link is right there, is a non-exhaustive list of literacy supports by school. So I know folks are always most interested in like what is actually available in my kid's school. So we essentially compiled a spreadsheet that's pulling data from a couple of different sources. This is, it doesn't include everything that's available at a given school. It's only what happens to be publicly available that we could pull off the DOE's website. And a lot of it is coming from budget data. So it doesn't reflect changes that may have happened at a school throughout the year. So like if a school has one of those special education and it has funding to get one of those special education intervention teachers, um, it'll be listed on that spreadsheet, but for all we know, the person who was in that role, maybe they left mid-year. They could be on parental leave. They might not actually be at the school and able to provide intervention. So this is really just meant as a starting point. So you can see if your child's school does have one of those special education intervention teachers, that's maybe something you could ask about is like, does that person work with students like my child? Do they have availability? And then there's a few other columns on there as well. So there's whether schools are in a phase 1 or a phase 2 district, meaning are they in a district that switched curriculum this year or is it happening next year? Then there is a column, a number of these SETS providers, I know someone asked about that, received some additional training in structured literacy interventions last year using federal stimulus funding, I believe. So that spreadsheet marks which of the SETS providers received that extra training last year and who hopefully are then a little better able to provide intensive intervention to students with disabilities like dyslexia. And then we've also flagged which specific schools are getting extra funding through one stream or another. That happens to be public. And like lots of schools also have other supports that aren't going to be listed here because historically the DOE has never provided kind of like a comprehensive database of like what is in each school. So since that doesn't exist, this is our attempt to kind of throw something together that is hopefully helpful and gives you a place to get started. So that's what that link is. If you want to learn more about NYC Reads, about what the DOE is doing this year, schools.nyc.gov/NYC Reads will take you there. Another website I just want to shout out is Reading Rockets. We have no affiliation with this site. It's just a great resource with so much information about how kids learn to read, why kids struggle, how you can help your child at home. There's resources for educators. It's just a great website with a ton of really great information. And I know if you just Google like learning to read, there's just so much out there. It can be very overwhelming and hard to know like what is accurate, what is actually good information. This website is awesome. A great place to start. Last slide. Maggie, do you mind dropping the link to the evaluation in the chat as well? We would love if you could complete a quick evaluation form about this webinar. It helps us improve our services and what we're doing. And it also helps us report to our funders so we can continue getting grants to do this work. And then obviously this is all really complicated. We threw a ton of information at you, most of which was very high level. And I know some folks had detailed questions that we didn't get to. So feel free to call our helpline, numbers on the screen again. If you want to talk to one of our education specialists, one-on-one about your particular situation with your child's school. Anything else, Maggie?
No, but I'm failing to get to that link. So if you can access it and share it with everybody, that would be great. Oh, here, I've got it now.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay. Did you get it, Maggie? If not, all.
I'm not 100% sure that I didn't just put the administrator link on.
Nope,
Sorry.
that's it.
Okay, we have the content knowledge, but so thank you to all of you who stuck with us. We really appreciate it. We will be, a couple people asked a few times, we will be sharing the PowerPoint and I believe the link to the recording. Oh, that's an interesting question.
That's an interesting question. I can't tell you how many hours. They were trained like through the DOE. So it was not like one of those like 40-hour super duper intensive courses that some OG specialists have received. But it is a lot more than folks within the schools have had historically. If that is at all helpful. there's a lot of places where we don't have super detailed information about exactly who has gotten how much training and what that training looked like.
So thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. If you fill out that evaluation after the fact, like if you're rushing, save the link, please. And we really do use those. They're really
Yes.
very, so much appreciated, your time, and watch for an email with the PowerPoint.
Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.